A respected black educator was simply boarding her flight home after receiving one of the nation's highest honors, but everything changed the moment she stepped on that plane. A flight attendant made a snap judgment, a routine check turned into public humiliation, and just minutes later, the police were called. But when they opened her briefcase, what they found shook the entire system. What happened next sparked outrage across the country and set off a movement no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because these are the stories that deserve to be seen. It was just an ordinary flight. Until it wasn't. The plane sat still on the tarmac, humming with the anticipation of departure. There was a particular stillness that comes not from silence, but from the unspoken, the glances, the stiffness, the shifting of shoulders when someone like Rosella Carter walks down the aisle. She had boarded quietly, like any other passenger. But of course, she wasn't just any other passenger, was she? Rosella was a black woman. A refined one at that, shoulders back, white blouse crisp, briefcase in hand. That briefcase, worn, polished, full of papers and memories, rested like a relic on her lap. She held it not just for its contents, but for what it meant: dignity, work, pride. And yet, in this land of democratic ideals and whispered judgments, it made her suspicious. Not because of what it held, but because of who held it. Now, let me say this. The cabin wasn't filled with overt hostility. No slurs. No confrontation. No one stood up and declared, "You don't belong here." But the thing about racism in America, particularly for those who've lived long enough to see its many faces, is that it rarely announces itself in full regalia anymore. No, it's more sophisticated than that now. It wears the uniform of routine procedure, the smile of customer service, and the voice of safety concerns. The woman across the aisle, let's call her Mrs. Whitaker, leaned into her companion with a whisper just loud enough to make sure Rosella could feel it. Not hear it, no, but feel it. That old, familiar shift in atmosphere that black folks know too well. The chill that doesn't come from air conditioning but from scrutiny. And Rosella, she felt it. But she didn't flinch. She'd spent her entire life walking through rooms like this, classrooms, board meetings, quiet hallways, knowing that she had to carry twice the grace to be seen as half as threatening. So she sat still, with mountains in the distance and history in her blood, hoping that this flight would be like any other. Hoping that today she could just be. But America has a way of reminding you, doesn't it? That no matter how hard you've worked, no matter the medals or degrees or plaques with your name spelled correctly, you're still one assumption away from being the problem. And as the flight attendant made her way down the aisle, eyes scanning, smile stiff, you could feel it coming. That moment. The interruption. The tap on the shoulder of your piece. "Ma'am," she said, with the kind of firmness that hides behind a smile, "I'm going to need you to come with me, with your briefcase." And just like that, the silence turned into judgment. The murmurs began. Not outrage, no. Curiosity, suspicion. The kind that doesn't ask why, but what did she do? In that moment, Rosella stood, not just from her seat, but from decades of being taught to comply, to cooperate, to keep calm even when your rights are being checked like baggage. Because here's the truth, my friends, racism doesn't always wear a hood. Sometimes it wears a badge. Sometimes it brings you a glass of water and calls you ma'am. But make no mistake, it still knows how to call the police when you don't smile the right way. And all she had done. I sat there. With a briefcase. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows a public humiliation. It's not silence, it's something much heavier. It wraps itself around your skin, follows your footsteps, and watches you breathe. Rosella Carter walked down that narrow aisle with her briefcase in hand, as though she were walking a gauntlet. And in truth, she was. The stares weren't loud. No one shouted. But they didn't have to. Judgment in this country is a performance of glances. Eyes that follow not with curiosity, but condemnation. Eyes that ask questions without ever daring to speak. What's she hiding? Why her? Rosella had lived long enough to know the choreography. She knew how to walk without trembling, how to hold her head high without appearing defiant, how to smile just enough to disarm, but not enough to provoke. Because being black and proud in America is still considered a kind of provocation. At the back of the plane, the galley smelled of burned coffee and plastic. It was a place not meant for passengers, especially not ones carrying the weight of history. The flight attendant, younger than Rosella's former students, stood waiting with forced professionalism. She didn't ask how Rosella was. She asked what was in her briefcase. A routine check, she said. But Rosella had been around too long to believe in routine. Because in her life, these routines only happened to people who looked like her. People with skin that made others nervous, even when they were silent. And here's the contradiction that haunts this nation. We are told we are equal on paper. We are told we have rights on paper. But in practice, suspicion has a skin tone. Security has a bias. And freedom, well, freedom still has its gatekeepers. She opened her briefcase slowly, her hands steady, her mind already somewhere else, perhaps in the school where she used to teach black and white children side by side. She used to believe that if she taught well enough, if she gave enough of herself, maybe, just maybe, her children would grow up in a country that saw people like her differently. But now, with her personal belongings being pawed through like contraband, she realized how fragile that hope had always been. The attendant glanced inside, found nothing, and offered the most hollow of words, "You're clear." Clear. As though she had been dirty. Dangerous. A problem to be neutralized. Rosella returned to her seat, but she no longer belonged to the quiet before takeoff. She belonged now to something far more precarious, the watchful eye of a system that didn't need evidence, just the right feeling. And that feeling, my brothers and sisters, is what has carried injustice for centuries in this country. You see, this isn't about security. This is about fear. A fear so old, it has become instinct. A fear that sees dignity as threat and blackness as danger. It's the kind of fear that builds prisons, writes policies, and ruins lives, all while claiming to protect. And yet, Rosella sat still. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She had long since learned that in America, your grief must never inconvenience others. Especially not at 30,000 feet. But her silence did not surrender. No, it was preparation. Because every injustice that goes unanswered writes a line in a story that refuses to end quietly. The wheels touched the ground with a gentle jolt, but for Rosella, the descent had begun long before the plane landed. It started in the aisle, in the stairs, in the galley's sterile judgment. And now, as the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, she sensed something else, a quiet movement, a murmur among the crew. The kind of silence people make when they're about to do something they know isn't right, but have convinced themselves is necessary. A voice over the intercom, smooth and official, asked the passengers to remain seated. Nothing unusual. But then came another voice, this one personal, directed at her. "Ma'am, please remain in your seat. Officers will be boarding shortly." In that moment, time didn't stop, but dignity did. You see, in America, we still live in a place where a black woman, dressed in pressed slacks and a white blouse, carrying nothing more than a briefcase, can become a suspect by default. Let us not pretend this is about security. This is about projection, about how power insists on protecting itself not from danger, but from discomfort. And Rosella Carter, quiet and composed, was apparently uncomfortable to behold. She sat still as instructed, though the entire plane turned into an audience. Children whispered. Men adjusted their coats and leaned forward. Women clutched their handbags not out of necessity, but reflex. The same reflex this country has had for generations, an instinct to assume guilt before grace. 2 officers entered. One held his chin a little too high, the other avoided eye contact entirely. Both carried the weight of bureaucracy dressed as authority. One looked at her and said, "Ma'am, please come with us." He didn't explain. He didn't have to. The badge had already made his voice law. Rosella stood. Not because she was afraid, but because she had learned, long ago, the cost of refusal. In this country, dignity often comes at a price. Sometimes that price is your peace. Sometimes your name. And for too many, your life. She stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge. Her heels struck the metal floor like punctuation marks in a sentence she had read before, many times. Now let's stop here, my dear elders, and ask a question. How many times have we seen this play before? How many routine procedures must we endure before we understand the routine is the problem? You see, the cruelty of modern racism is not in the shout, it's in the shrug. It's not in burning crosses, but in silent policies and polite words. We're just doing our job. It's just protocol. It's nothing personal. But for Rosella, it was always personal. Because being followed, being questioned, being singled out, it's always personal when the only common denominator is the color of your skin. They led her down a corridor, not unlike the ones she had walked through in schools, in libraries, in government buildings, places she had helped build, helped serve. Yet here she was, being escorted like contraband through an institution that could not see her humanity beyond their fear. At the end of that corridor stood a door. Behind it, questions she did not owe, suspicion she did not earn, and a table she would once again have to sit at not as a woman of merit, but as an object of scrutiny. But understand this, Rosella Carter walked through that door not with shame, but with memory. Because Black America does not suffer amnesia. We remember every stare, every whisper, every time we were told we were almost welcome, nearly enough, close to being seen. And still we rise. They sat her in a room with walls so white they burned. A single metal table, 2 chairs, and a light that didn't flicker but buzzed, like it was whispering secrets to itself. There were no windows. Only mirrors that didn't reflect truth, only suspicion. Rosella Carter sat quietly, her briefcase placed deliberately before her. To them, it was just a bag. But to her, it held decades, lesson plans, lecture notes, letters from students, memories of a life spent serving a country that never quite knew how to serve her back. Then they came in. A man and a woman, both in uniform, both with practiced neutrality smeared across their faces like poorly painted masks. "Let's begin," the woman said, flipping open a folder as if it contained justice. They asked her about the contents of her bag, about her travel plans, about why the flight crew had flagged her. Not once did they say what they were looking for. Because they weren't looking for anything in her bag, they were searching for something wrong with her being. This, my friends, is the anatomy of modern racism. It doesn't curse at you anymore, it questions you with a smile. It doesn't wear a hood, it wears a badge and says, "Ma'am," with rehearsed civility. Now, I ask you, what is more violent? The whip? Or the system that replaces it with suspicion and then calls it safety? Rosella answered each question with the patience of someone who's been through this before. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. Because she knew the game, knew how quickly angry becomes aggressive and assertive becomes threat. She said, "You have the bag. You've opened it. You've seen the contents. So, what now?" The officers exchanged a glance. The kind of glance that admits everything without saying a word. And the man said, "We're just trying to understand the situation." Understand? Understand what? That a Black woman in first class might just be successful, accomplished, dignified? You see, the lie of equality in America isn't that it doesn't exist, it's that it exists conditionally. You can rise, yes, but only so long as your rising doesn't remind anyone of where you came from. Rosella asked for a lawyer. They paused. Then they told her she wasn't under arrest, just being held for questioning. A phrase soaked in irony. Because if this wasn't detainment, then what was it? An invitation? But here's the truth, beloved. What she was really being asked to do was shrink. To apologize for her presence. To make herself smaller so others might feel bigger. And still, she refused. "I'm done answering redundant questions," she said, her voice calm but iron-wrapped. "Unless you have a reason to hold me, I'd like to leave." The room fell silent. The silence of a country caught in its own reflection. And outside the room, in the terminal, someone had filmed her being escorted off the plane. A shaky video, uploaded with the caption, "Security concern or racial profiling?" And just like that, the world began to watch. But even as the video gained traction, Rosella Carter remained in that room, alone, still fighting not just for her freedom, but for her right to be ordinary. For the right to sit on a plane and not be extraordinary, not be suspected, not be the representative for an entire race. My dear elders, you who've lived long enough to see separate fountains and schools turn into separate assumptions, tell me, when does the burden end? When does our citizenship become unqualified? Because if Rosella Carter, with her medals and her history and her dignity, can still be treated like a threat, then what does that say about the story this country keeps telling itself? When Rosella Carter was finally released from that cold room, there was no apology waiting for her. No hand extended in remorse. Just muttered, "You're free to go," as if the hours of suspicion and humiliation were a clerical error in a ledger too vast to question. She stepped back into the terminal like a woman returning from a war no one would admit had happened. But something had changed. In a corner near the coffee stand, a man in a navy suit, neatly pressed, eyes sharp behind modest glasses, watched her quietly. He hadn't moved since she was led off the plane. His name was Everett Dawson, a civil rights attorney with a quiet fire in his chest. He had seen what happened. The way the attendants whispered. The way the officers arrived was already convincing. "Ms. Carter," he said, stepping forward with careful authority, "I saw what they did. If you're willing to talk, I'm willing to listen. Now let me say this clearly, because you know it in your bones. Witnessing injustice is one thing. Naming it is another. For every 1,000 eyes that see, maybe one pair has the courage to speak." Everett Dawson had that courage. They sat at a small table near Gate 17, two black souls in a white space that had already made its decision about who they were. "I'm fine," Rosella said, out of habit. That ancestral response, passed down from slaves and sharecroppers and schoolteachers alike, the insistence on being fine when the world is anything but. "You don't look fine," Everett said gently. "You look like someone who's been asked to explain her existence one too many times." Rosella didn't respond at first. Just stared out past the window where the tarmac glowed under the terminal lights. "Finally," she said, "they opened my briefcase like it was a bomb. But it held lesson plans, commencement speeches, letters from children who still believe this country might one day live up to its promises. And friends, here's where the story turns. Because while Rosella was collecting herself, a video, taken by a passenger, had already been posted online. It showed her being led down the aisle. Calm, dignified. A flight attendant whispered to a police officer. A caption beneath the footage asked the question no one on the flight had dared speak aloud. What exactly made her suspicious? Within the hour, it began to spread. First among teachers, those who knew Rosella's name, who'd read her op-eds and cited her work. Then among activists. Then among strangers who saw, in her quiet poise, a mirror of every indignity they'd been taught to swallow. But with attention comes its own brand of cruelty. On one side, support, admiration, solidarity. On the other, doubt, accusations, the same old refrain, "She must have done something." Because that, my dear elders, is the other side of racism. Not just the act, but the denial. The need to believe that the system is fair, that suspicion is earned, that dignity is conditional. Everett placed his card on the table. "You don't have to say yes," he told her. "But if you want to fight this, if you want to make them see what they did, I'll be with you." Rosella looked at the card, then at him, then at the people who stared, not out of concern, but curiosity. She didn't answer then. Not with words. But with the way she stood, straightened her blouse, and walked out of the terminal with her briefcase held like a shield. The question now was not whether the world would believe her. The question was whether she still believed in a world worth confronting. Because sometimes, beloved, the hardest part of being Black in America isn't surviving the injustice, it's deciding, again and again, whether to hope in spite of it. The trouble with silence is that it never stays quiet for long. It waits. It listens. And then it speaks in a voice that chills the soul. Rosella Carter returned home to her modest house nestled beneath the shadows of the Blue Ridge Mountains. A place that once felt safe, rooted in the soil of hard-earned dignity. Now it felt watched. The front door creaked with a kind of warning. The air inside no longer wrapped her in peace, but whispered of something unsettled. Her phone rang just after sunset. The number was unfamiliar, local, but she answered anyway. Habit, trust, or maybe fatigue. A voice, slow and male, said slowly, "You need to drop this. You don't know what you're stirring up." Click. No name, no explanation. Just enough syllables to make the walls of her house feel closer, the night darker. You see, it wasn't the volume of the threat that mattered. It was its implication. That somewhere out there, someone believed she had stepped too far out of place. That in defending her own dignity, she had violated the rules. And isn't that the truest part of our American contradiction? The belief that freedom is promised to all, but only granted to some, and revoked the moment they dare to use it. Rosella didn't cry. She didn't panic. She went to her briefcase, the same one the officers had pawed through, and opened it slowly. The contents were as she left them: lesson plans, correspondence, the Presidential Citizen's Medal she received for her decades of service. But something was off. The ribbon on the medal was twisted. The papers no longer aligned with her meticulous sense of order. A slight scratch marred the surface of the brass plate inside the case. Not vandalism. Not theft. No, this was something more insidious. A message. A quiet way of saying, "We were here. We can reach you." A gentle violation, wrapped in plausible deniability. The next morning, Rosella sat on her porch with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Her eyes scanned the street. Nothing moved. No sign of intruders, just the distant rumble of a school bus and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But her body told her something her eyes could not confirm. She was not alone in this fight, and she was not beyond its reach. Everett called shortly after sunrise. "You look like you haven't slept," he said, voice calm but edged with concern. "I haven't," Rosella replied. "Someone broke into my briefcase. They left everything, but not as they found it." There was silence on the line. Then Everett's voice, more steel than before. "That's not negligence. That's intimidation. We're going public." And here's where the story swells, because this is where the game changes. It's one thing to question a system. It's another to expose its cruelty. But when you threaten the comfort of the architects, when you push against the hidden architecture of power, they respond not with rebuttals, but with reminders. Not just reminders of what they can do, but of what they have always done. Rosella had a choice that morning. She could have folded back into anonymity. She would have retreated to the quiet of her retirement, letting the story fade with the news cycle. That would have been understandable. But Rosella Carter did not become who she was by yielding to fear. She stood. She buttoned her blouse. And by noon, she had agreed to sit for her first televised interview. As the cameras rolled and the lights bore down, she said one thing with the weight of generations in her voice. "I'm not here because I want to be a symbol. I'm here because someone has to be. I've been silent long enough. And silence has never kept us safe." The moment you take your truth and place it gently but firmly in front of a camera, you do not simply tell a story, you ignite a flame. Rosella Carter sat in that studio, calm as stone, the lights bright but not blinding. The reporter across from her smiled the way white America often smiles at a black woman they cannot quite categorize: courteous, curious, but cautious. The smile that asks 100 questions but dares not voice even one honestly. "Why now?" the reporter asked. Rosella didn't flinch. "Because I've been holding my breath for 65 years, she said. "And I've decided to start breathing again." That clip was only 13 seconds long, but by nightfall it had spread like wildfire. Old colleagues shared it. Former students wept over it. Strangers, some black, some not, wrote messages about their own small humiliations, the extra security checks, the tightened lips at job interviews, the invitations that never came. But for every voice raised in solidarity, another rose to defend the illusion. "You're making this about race," they wrote. As if it hadn't always been about race. As if Rosella's body, her voice, her mere presence hadn't already been judged, long before she opened her mouth to speak. But see, what white America sometimes forgets, especially those grown from the soil of the Old South and watered in the shade of privilege, is that history is not past. It is present. It lives not only in textbooks, but in glances, in silences, in policies written in ink and interpreted in fear. And so the fire spread. A second interview was scheduled, then a panel, then an invitation from a national morning show. Rosella, who once avoided the spotlight like a sickness, now stood in it, not because she wanted attention, but because she refused invisibility. She spoke slowly, clearly, in a tone that reminded the nation of its unfinished business. "I was not removed from that plane because of safety," she told one interviewer. "I was removed because someone looked at me and saw a question mark where there should have been a period." The network edited out that line. They said it was too abstract. But we who have lived this, we knew exactly what she meant. That week, Rosella received a letter. It came in a plain white envelope, handwritten, no return address. It read, "You should be grateful. At least you weren't arrested. At least you weren't shot." Gratitude. That poisonous word. The word that has so often been weaponized against us. Be grateful for the job, for the seat, for the air. As if our dignity was a favor, as if our presence required permission. Rosella didn't show the letter to Everett. Not yet. Instead, she folded it, placed it gently in her briefcase, beside the medal and the court documents. She carried it not as fear, but as fuel. Because the more they told her to be quiet, the louder her presence became. And that, beloved, is the quiet revolution of the oppressed. Not always with fists. Not always with protest. But with endurance. With the audacity to remain where you've been told not to be. With the clarity to speak plainly, even when the world prefers its truths softened with sugar. By the end of the week, the airline issued a lukewarm statement. No apology, only concern. They valued diversity. They believed in safety. They were reviewing protocols. But we've heard that tune before. It's an old song, played on a broken record, and it always skips the part where they say they're wrong. Still, Rosella pressed forward. Because she understood something essential. You do not change a system by waiting for it to become self-aware. You confront it with your presence, with your truth, with your refusal to disappear. By the time they brought her to Capitol Hill, Rosella Carter was no longer just a woman with a briefcase. She had become, unwillingly and yet unshakably, a symbol, a living contradiction in a country that demands silence from the very mouths it claims to protect. She sat before the congressional subcommittee like she had once sat before her students, upright, measured, patient. The room was sterile, wood-paneled with flags draped in ceremonial dignity. But beneath the surface? Tension. Not the loud kind. No fists were raised. No slurs shouted. Only the polite violence of implication. One congressman leaned forward, his words dipped in condescension disguised as curiosity. "Miss Carter, don't you think you're perhaps overstating the racial component here? After all, mistakes happen every day in airline travel." Rosella didn't blink. "Sir," she said, voice steady as stone, "mistakes don't happen in patterns." And the room shifted. Not visibly, but perceptibly. Like a piano string pulled just too tight. That is the trouble with racism in America. It does not arrive as a monster. It comes dressed as reason, speaks the language of safety, policy, efficiency. But the math never adds up. Not when Black and brown people bear the cost of mistakes more often, more violently, more quietly than others. It was then that the evidence was presented. Emails, memos, security directives that used phrases like observe deviations from expected passenger demeanor, language that danced around legality but reeked of bias. Each document is a reflection not just of an airline, but of a nation addicted to euphemism, to calling injustice by softer names. A hush fell over the room as Everett Dawson stepped forward with his final submission, the whistleblower's full testimony, delivered under oath, implicating Prescott and a chain of executives who had nurtured that system like it was a sacred garden. When it ended, no one clapped. Because that's the thing about truth, it doesn't ask for applause. It demands acknowledgement. And that's the part America has always struggled with, The Reckoning. That evening, as Rosella left the courthouse and the press swarmed with lights and questions, a young black girl tugged at her coat. No cameras caught the moment. No microphones. Just the whisper of a child. "I saw you on TV," she said. "You looked like my grandma." Rosella smiled, eyes watering not from sadness, but from the ache of recognition. "Then that means you're going to grow up strong," she replied. "Because your grandma's still standing." Later that night, a new headline swept across the networks. Airline CEO resigns amid scandal, Federal Oversight Committee formed. And it should have felt like victory. But Rosella knew better. Because the resignation of one man does not repair the erosion of a people's dignity. Laws can be rewritten. Policies can be retrained. But hearts, that's the real battlefield. She returned home to Asheville quietly, no parade this time. Just the porch, the rocking chair, the mountains breathing in the distance. She sat down with her tea, opened her briefcase, and placed inside it a letter from the Department of Justice, confirmation of systemic failure and recommendation for sweeping reform. She didn't smile. She exhaled. Because she understood something every elder in this country has lived long enough to see. Victory is not the end. It's the chance to rest before the next fight. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all. That for people like Rosella, for the children of exiles, of dreamers, of survivors, justice is not a destination. It is a ritual. A quiet, burning insistence. That we belong. That we matter. That we will not disappear. And so ends the story, not in triumph, not in sorrow, but in resolve. Because to live as a black soul in America is to know that your fight is older than your name. And your courage, your clarity, is your inheritance.